pleased to welcome our first panel. Let me begin at the beginning. Professor Beckert. He is the director of the Max Planck Institute for the Study of Societies, and he has specialized in economic sociology. I'd also like to welcome Professor Schön. He is the vice president of the Max Planck Gesellschaft, and I'm sure you know him from earlier meetings. Mr. Schwenker, we've just heard from him, and I'd also like to welcome Professor Mellinghoff. He is the president of the German Fiscal Court. It's a great honor for us to have you with us today, as well as Professor Korioth. We have known him for many years now, and he is a professor of public law and ecclesiastical law at the Ludwig Maximilians University in Munich. I'd like to begin with a question to you, Mr. Beckert. How can you talk about the change from uncertainty in history? Do we have more uncertainty than in the past? Well, I'd like to pick up on what Professor Schwenker said. He focused on the trends in companies over the last 20 years, and I think he made a very good presentation on uncertainty in companies, and this has become greater than it was in the past. And let me go one step further. This also applies not only to companies, the fact that there's more uncertainty than before, but this also applies to employees. It also applies to politics and their relationship to the economy. Now, the reason for this, a more general reason for this, is the fact that in the last 30 years, our economic structures have changed considerably, and they are much more focused on competition. And with competition, we have contingencies which are seen as uncertainty, greater uncertainty for the players involved. But it's not only the case in the economy and companies. In other words, the fact that uncertainty has increased over the last 30 years, it also applies to social areas. For example, the trends in families in the last 50 years. We had very traditional family models, and now we have plural models. In other words, the questions of, are you going to get married or not? Do you have children or not? Who are you going to marry? The options that we have in all of these areas have expanded dramatically. And these are also questions which are uncertainties for individuals. And if we think back over a longer historic period, then you can say that you can't just say as a lump sum that we are living in uncertain times and that everything was more certain in the past. Think about a war situation, for example, or think of the threats of infectious diseases, the threats that they presented to us 100 years ago. So if we talk about the developments in modern times, we can also see trends showing that we can better cope with uncertainties. And at the same time, that in history, we have had long phases of major aspects of uncertainty. It's not a historical linear process showing the increase in uncertainty or insecurities. That's very interesting because I all think that we're living in especially difficult, complex times. That's quite reassuring. Well, I would like to pick up on what was just said, but I'd like to take it a little bit further. We have uncertainties that we've talked about already, and I also think that Mr. Schwenker focused on the uncertainty with regard to the future, with regard to information, what the world has to offer us, and the causality that results. But that's only one side of the coin. So you could ask whether people in the Middle Ages, they didn't have that much information, but they might have been faced with a lethal disease the very next days or might have been attacked maybe they also had a certain similar degree of uncertainty, but there are two more dimensions to it. First of all, the uncertainty in decision-making. In traditional societies or in simple societies, there wasn't all that much that needed to be decided on. Today, whether we see this as individuals in our individual life or an entrepreneur making plans for a company, it's not just a question of the uncertainty about the future, but we also have the uncertainty with all of the different options we have. What education should we get? What geographic limits do we set ourselves in our activities? And an increase in options is good on the one hand. In other words, people can shape more than they could in the past, but the individual has a feeling of insecurity. And this is also associated with the problem of failing. If you have a fate, if you have the impression that you've made a mistake, not just a question of fate that has ruined someone, but if someone has the feeling they have made a mistake, that's a different point. And then we have to consider the question of our aims. Mr. David mentioned this. No matter what I do, I have to know what I want. That, too, is something that is faced with more insecurity, because in the individual plans of individuals, this is something that is no longer defined by society. Each individual is his own project and his own individual. He doesn't only have to decide how he wants to arrive at a certain goal, but he also has to decide what his goals are in the first place. So this makes it even more unsure and raises the possibilities for failure. Well, I think we can add to that and say that uncertainty, in other words, this includes the word knowledge in the German word for uncertainty. And we've heard already that the politicians or the military could have known, but there is no certainty when you consider all of the different sources of information. And if you think about all of the information that is presented to us today, and to pick out the right information, that would give us certainty, but we don't have that. We've never had that certainty, as we've heard, but I think this has become greater because there's more knowledge. When there's less knowledge, then there are fewer options. It's not only a question of knowledge, it's also a question of the organization of our society. And sometimes you can give you a contrast between traditional and modern societies, and traditional societies are regulated. They have their standards. There's very little freedom of maneuver for the individuals. A modern society is characterized by more individualization. This process of individualization gives us more freedom. And when we consider our social developments, especially in the last 30 or 40 years, picking up on the 1968 movement. But these are trends which give us more responsibility in taking decisions for the individual, and also failure in our life plan. And this makes it much more plausible, because the draft per se as a possibility exists. Either this can be implemented or not. In traditional societies, they didn't have these options or this room for maneuver in decision-making. Mr. Korioth? Well, I think one point should be emphasized here: the distinction between traditional and modern societies. Uncertainty is part of our life, but the type of uncertainty has changed. In traditional societies, it was more the uncertainties with regard to nature, what might happen the next day, but the room for maneuver for the individual was static. This was defined, and life was led, but there were not all that very many possibilities for taking action. But the situation in modern society is quite different. We have many more options, which gives us more uncertainty. And this is a situation that we're all subjected to. You can only avoid this if you move into a monastery, if you decide to become a monk. But even then, you don't know if perhaps in 10 years' time, maybe the monastery will be so small that they will have to shut it down. Uncertainty as an opportunity. What do you have to say on that? Mr. Schwenker? Well, I've already made my opinion clear on that point. I do think that uncertainty is an opportunity. Things can happen that are good, and things that might really fit into my situation. So that's why I know it's easier said than done. You shouldn't be afraid of uncertainty. It's easier said than done. If you're honest with yourself, you have this feeling every now and again. And we're faced here with contradictions that have made it very clear here. Of course, it's awful to say that our life was predefined. But on the other hand, because there's so much diversity now, and it's a question of reducing complexity, we sometimes are happy when some decisions are made for us, because decisions also include the possibility of failure. If I was not able to decide and something didn't work, then I didn't fail. Sometimes that helps as well. So this contradiction is everywhere, and it depends on how you look at a problem. Take a look at demography. That can be one of the major threats that we're faced with today. But I can say that this is a wonderful fortune. I'm glad that I can grow older, I can work longer, and this doesn't face me with the problem that if I've taken a decision once for the job I want to do, that this couldn't have been corrected in the past, but now we can correct this decision. So I think that this is a situation, and the contradictions that we have to deal with, this gives us this feeling of uncertainty. So you might be a failure, but then you get a second chance. Well, Mr. Schwenker, I'd like to refer to your presentation. It was fascinating, and I think it showed us a whole panorama in practical and theoretical terms. And this is a question of corporate strategy. You talked about all the fads and directions and movements, risk diversification, focusing on core businesses, diversification again. And then you concluded with a solution where I have to ask myself, will this work? In other words, you focused on the individual, on the personality of the manager, and then at the end you said a number of times that this should be someone who can disseminate the feeling of security, someone who can give the company, the employees, the feeling that they know where we are headed, that I have an idea as to where we are headed. But let me ask one question. Is it just a question of the feeling of security in a certain situation? Then we'd almost be back to a traditional society where you can get the idea of security across. Or is it a question of someone being able to look better into the future than others and then being able to reflect this in actual success? Well, that's not all that easy. And that's why you also asked that question. So let me try to answer that question. What I'm concerned with here is that in today's situation, we need people to lead others, not just the managing board, but it goes down to a lower level. People who cannot give them security, but they can get the idea of security across, and to deal with the situation honestly and say that they don't know what the future will bring. If you say, I know how it's going to work, and this is how we're going to get there, and then, of course, you can get people behind you. But that doesn't work today, especially if you are open and honest. So I need someone who without losing authority, can say, I don't know myself either, but I have an idea, and I am going to stand by this idea. This is an opinion, and you have to have a conviction. And I know to have a conviction, this is also negative as well. Your conviction might be wrong. That's why you have to be able to correct it. In other words, that you have to move in a direction so that you're still able to correct that direction you've taken. And that picks up on our first round. To motivate people today, you have to give them the feeling that I've understood the difficulties that they're dealing with. So that's why I believe, I didn't mention this yet because I had gone over time, but I think if we think in scenarios, this is something that will help us, strategically speaking. And this can give us an idea to have a vision of the future. So a manager today must personify talking about visions of the future, giving the people the opportunity to reflect on this for themselves. Is this a good or a bad vision of the future? And you can never give the people certainty, but you can give them the idea that I am dealing with people who are thinking about what they're doing, and that's a whole lot. If I understand you correctly, you are assuming that we've got problems, and this is what the situation is. We are not magicians, and that's where you get your strength. No, we're not magicians, but we have the ability to know that we don't know what the world will look like in the future, but we can develop visions of the future. That's the difference. So that's exactly what you've said. In other words, this is the topic for today, expecting failure. And to include this as well, the other aspect that I wanted to mention briefly is the fact that management, I think I've just lost my train of thought. I'll come back in just a minute. I would like to pick up on one point. I don't know if it was you or Mr. David who said that it's the wrong decision is rarely based on incorrect information. It's often based on a misassessment or wishful thinking or on a too predefined plan and adapting to the flow of information. So it could be counterproductive to have too much security. That's right, and that's what we're talking about. If I disseminate too much security, then I will generate security because it may prove not to be true. I have to strike a balance here, and this brings us to a very difficult question. Of course, you can cope with uncertainty by having a number of different plans. We're all familiar with that. Plan B, for instance. There's not just Plan A, but you've also got Plan B, which could also fail. You can talk about this at length. I don't know if it's clever to have a Plan B. Maybe it would be better to just have your Plan A and to really try to get it across, because Plan B also gives you the opportunity to not take Plan A all that seriously, because you don't put everything into it because you know you've got your Plan B. I saw a nice poster recently, and it said if Plan A fails and Plan B fails as well, then we have 24 more letters for our plans. So I think that this would characterize our situation. Sometimes I really don't know. Should we really talk about a Plan B if you've got a Plan A that you want to carry out? But to arrive at Plan A, you have to think about the different scenarios and the alternatives. That's the way it should be. So this is, again, your strategy. Mr. Beckert, well, I'd like to come back. I've picked up my train of thought again. What you have talked about, visions of the future and strategies that we want to discuss. Well, if you take a look at this in abstract terms, this is a way of reducing complexities. But what is being reduced is not the objective complexity of our environment. It's our actions in our environment. So we're excluding a lot of things, and that's what the strategy is, to have a vision which is to look consistently into the future. And it's not surprising that, especially in a situation where uncertainty and insecurity is increasing, that you want to have these definitions. This is on an organizational level and on a HR level. Of course, the need to have more stability. Well, the points you raised, two of them are quite interesting. First of all, organizational slag. That means that you have to expect to fail, that failure is a possibility, that if my strategy fails, that doesn't mean that all of my possibilities for the future are lost. But no, I have a second chance. And it's quite interesting that you say that today. 5 years ago, there was a discussion in Austria with private equity investors in a lawyer's office, and I used the term organizational slag, and they said, oh, don't use that term. Keep the leverage as high as possible so that you will have high risks and to optimize your profit. And that was the strategy that failed in 2008. So I think it's very interesting that you mention this in your organizational theory, that you've come back to this term. And a second point that you didn't have in your 3 points, but one of the ones that I found most interesting was when you said you have to have people with different experience. They need to be involved. And that means that you don't limit yourself to just one way of thinking. You need to be able to assess processes of change, future possibilities with different schools of thought. And I think that, if I think to the financial crisis, the whole idea that the way politicians think as well in the 1990s and the early 2000s, this is also characterized by this economic vision, maybe too much so. Alternatives such as how the economy works and how markets function, I think these should have been taken into account much more to have a better assessment as to what processes of change are actually occurring, what options we have, what are the possible scenarios. Could I comment briefly? I've already talked enough, but I did want to say one thing. I think this is very important. It's not very easy to put into practice because interdisciplinarity in management have to be combined with the ability to manage day-to-day business. So intellectuals alone will not suffice. We need to combine that. And the second point is just what you said. And I always say that this two-tier board system, the board of management and the supervisory board, which we have in Germany, it's discussed again and again. A one-tier system, as in the United States, would be better because they can take decisions more quickly. Well, I think this is just security. It gives us the opportunity. It gives us the opportunity to reflect on a strategy twice, where it is developed, and then to discuss it at the supervisory board. That gives me more possibilities to include more experience here. And I think sometimes you have to take the time. And you shouldn't get nervous and all upset about it. Things have to be done quickly, but sometimes it is important to take the time to reflect on these things. Then we would have the corrective measure that I mentioned before. I'd like to come back to Mr. Schwenker's presentation. One thing irritated me. You said that the decision makers fail because of themselves. And this is, the connotation is that it's something awful when this happens. And if I consider this topic, expect to fail, this is a very open question. It can also give us a positive way of looking at failure. In other words, you can learn from your failure, and the question is, can we really say, if we look back at the different decision makers with the different possibilities they had. Did they really fail because of themselves, or did they take a decision which on that particular point would not achieve the goal in mind, but it helped them make progress to follow other targets? Perhaps because their personal target system was optimized, and this might have put others in a more difficult situation. But you're right. I exaggerated a bit, but what I was trying to say when I say that they failed, well, the whole context was related to the fact that we need to consider how we understand management. This is a conventional discussion between leadership and management. Management is often seen as something which is more or less boring, thinking about things, etc. And leadership is more charismatic, somebody who knows where we're headed, and based on his optimism, his drive, his charisma, can also organize things in a particular way. And I think that, and I can refer to Henry Mintzberg. He put this very nicely. He said, I think that something is out of balance because somebody didn't want to be a good manager. He wanted to be a good leader. If you want to be a good leader and also claim to know exactly where you're headed, and then you come up with the hypers, and then this is something that we've seen empirically. So this is then means that they're no longer able to reflect on things. That's what I meant when I said people can fail. If you think back, you can explain all strategies, either successful or not. After the fact, it's easier, of course. If you know things with hindsight, it's much easier. But I think the difference is the fact that what could I have known, and did I think about it sufficiently, or was I so convinced that I knew where we were headed? And that's why we have this corrective function, which plays an important role. Failing, per se. Well, at the beginning I said it's not nice to fail. No one wants to fail, but it does offer us a great deal of potential. We can learn from our mistakes. So every time we fail, we also have to see the advantage associated with it. It's difficult. It's easier said than done to say that you can learn from your mistakes. But let me ask you a question. In your consultancy, do you cultivate a positive way of seeing failure? So people who don't meet their targets in their company, you give them the positive results from this failure? Do they also assess it in a positive way? There have been studies on hospitals that they are very successful if they reward people who disclose their failures, so to speak. Well, we try because tolerating errors is good because there are people, they are encouraged to take decisions. Otherwise, we have another problem. If you are penalized, then people won't take decisions anymore. So tolerating errors is very important. And I think there are cultural differences. And I do think that quite often you will see that failure, corporate failure or career failure in the Anglo-Saxon area is seen quite differently as opposed to Germany. Just let me give you one example. The new economy, everyone wanted to be an entrepreneur. They all had business ideas. And back then, many people thought that was fantastic. And they found it great when people left a company, not only here, but in other companies as well. I'm going to be freelance. And then 99% of them failed. But at the same time, people said, well, I told you so. And you shouldn't have done what you did. Well, we tried to get these people back, the people who had left us, to become freelance. But I think this is a cultural point that's very important. Part of our society sees that the failure is seen with the attitude, I told you so. Mr. Mellinghoff, I think you were trying to say that our culture of making mistakes in companies, especially in Asia, I think this makes the companies very strong. They call upon their employees to tell them what is wrong. We can learn from that, and we will come out better. We'll have a better strategy, a better product, a better environment. I think that's what Mr. Mellinghoff meant. So did I. So let's move on to Mr. Schön. Well, I would like to focus on corporate activities. And when we talk about failure or a lack of success, let's focus more on the anthropological question, failure of an individual or human beings. In today's culture, individuals are basically told what their ideals should be: financial success, beauty, intellectual brilliance, social environment. This is what they are told they must achieve, and this makes many people subjectively think that they have failed. Maybe our society's responsibility should be to become more modest, or is this something that would be inappropriate? Let me ask. I don't want to imply an answer to my question. And we discussed this yesterday afternoon with Mr. Korioth. We talked about how society should feel when it comes to an individual's failure. In a company, this is a culture where the individual and recognizing a mistake or a failure is accepted. But let's take that even further. What I'd like to ask now is, shouldn't we also consider the target functions of individuals? Shouldn't we reconsider that before we start to talk about very high aims and the questions of imperfection? Mr. Beckert? I can't answer that question. All I can give you is some empirical information. That's the way it is. So if you talk about ideals in terms of beauty, well, that's a good example. There's a lot of pressure, and this is increasing. And experience of failure is out there. These are processes which are associated with individualization in society, suffering. They can result in suffering on a personal level. I don't have an answer to the question here, because how do you want to control these processes, and how could this be made legitimate? So this would be paternalistic approaches? I really don't know. Well, there have been some studies that talk about how important failure is. Leaders, CEOs, and women have failed. I'm not talking about complete knockout, but they fail because they've reached their limits in getting what they want achieved. Think about leading female CEOs. They worked in Asian companies. They were confronted with a male culture and were not successful. Their ideas were not successful simply because they were women. So they simply learned to deal with this rejection. Social rejection is also a type of failure. And I think in preparing for this conference, I realized how important it is. I learned how important failure is. When we go to bed tonight, we'll all know that we have all failed at one time or another. But not each and every one of us would be here today if we hadn't failed at some point in time. Mr. Korioth? Well, I think that answering Wolfgang Schön's question has already been given here during this discussion. And I think our discussions over the last day and a half have come up with a certain result. I was positively surprised to learn that uncertainty can be seen as an opportunity, as a possibility. It should not be demonized as only a problem, as something which should be eliminated if at all possible, and that failure can also be understood as something good. Of course, in society, individuals don't have certainty because we're not involved in big groups. They're more afraid of individual failure, but I don't think this is related to any other points. I think if we remember all of this, uncertainty and insecurity is something which also offers us an opportunity. Mr. Korioth mentioned something yesterday. It's not individuals who can fail, it's projects that individuals have that can fail. And if we focus on the people, then I think you will see that there is a productive way of dealing with uncertainty and failure whenever possible.
Ein letztes Wort noch.
Maybe one last remark before we ask the audience to join us concerning the claims we've learned in our debate, and that's what we heard yesterday from Mr. Speckach also, that there are two aspects which do not really coincide. On the one hand, the economic development in the late 1970s plus the particular approach of the 1968 movement with its idea of self-fulfillment. And we do have here a contradiction. On the one hand, the particular wishes of the individual in terms of how to fulfill himself, herself. And on the other hand, the demands and claims of the industry and the business world. Any further comment up here? Otherwise, I'd like to invite the audience to take the floor. Well, let me tell you that our constitution allows for different models of life and lifestyles, but there is theory and practice because we do have the dignity of human beings and the social state and the possibilities to help the individual offer assistance, aid, and consulting. But then there is also a lack of warmth and empathy, I'd say, because if a human being fails with respect to a goal society has defined, which is different from the individual determining his or her goals, there is not much support. And there is a difference because within a certain period of time, the individual identifies goals he or she wants to pursue. But then there are also objectives identified and defined by society, which are much more difficult to achieve. So I think we have to have much more measure here. And there should also be modesty and understanding.
Ich stelle mich nochmal vor, Christoph Paulus.
Christoph Paulus is my name. May I introduce you? Christoph Paulus is also one of the panelists to speak to you and before you today. He is a professor at the Humboldt University in Berlin. He has developed a concept for the insolvency law in the countries of the world. Right. I mean, insolvency law doesn't help you much if things fail. And that's what we're talking about. We're talking about failure. And indeed, we want to change things here. And there are cultural differences. We have to see the insolvency law in the United States offers a second chance. That's a major difference. Here, you are stigmatized. And there are lots of people who tend to laugh at you and to not offer any support whatsoever for those who fail. Now, what can be done? Small steps. That's always a solution. That's always a recommendation. I mean, you cannot change the overall feeling. But there is also an EU directive which wants to establish the concept of the second chance in Europe as well, i.e. to see the positive implications of failure. Of course, we do have to cater for the negative implications by means of the insolvency law, of course, but then we also have to see the positive dimension, and that's one of the major plans in the pipeline right now. Now, I was surprised when I heard you speaking about the second chance and that people have to have the right of failing. I mean, that's what we have always admired in the United States, because there people get a second chance. Whereas here, societies are much more brutal. Here, people are stigmatized once they fail, and that's the way it is. And I mean, that's the way it's always been, and we are currently seeing debates once again about leaders who have to leave their positions because they have failed. But I'd love to see the second chance become an option. Max Gutscher, please. Maximilian Gutscher. Now, I'm a bit surprised because you talk about failure and that we have to take failure into account. Now, you have talked about uncertainty. And of course, we also have to see insecurity and external factors in this context. Vagaries are always a possibility, I'd say. But actually, this is not the whole picture, because we also know more, or we get a chance to know more. I mean, we are reading about big data in the newspapers each and every day. We have to learn how to handle them, how to use them efficiently. So we have to rethink our strategies in order to not only put failure on a pedestal. Now, Mr. Becker, you've mentioned insecurity, uncertainty, and risk, different concepts and concepts. Maybe you have to repeat. Well, that's probably the offer of a short lecture. I think I was quite clear when talking about modern societies. There are a number of aspects we are faced with in modern societies, and we can cope. That was not the case in the past. The modern financial markets, for example, and credit risks, and the assessment of the risk. I mean, there were wonderful historical essays about the first credit rating agencies in the 19th century. They were based in New York, and they had telegraph connection, and they asked the local priest whether a person who applied for a loan was credit worthy in order to decide how much this person should get. I mean, that's comparable to the modern scoring process we have when it comes to consumer credits today. I mean, if you consider insurances and financial mathematics, you realize that we are capable of much more than could be done in the past. However, it's not a linear process. And it's not going to be possible to reduce the risk and have it be zero eventually. But if you think back to the financial crisis and look at the tools which are being used, you realize that the tools that are being used trigger new uncertainties in society. So there is both, or there are both sides in this process. And when I spoke about the last 30 years and the economy, I underlined the fact that the markets are free and that competition is being regulated, but this means new elements that trigger uncertainty among entrepreneurs. More regulation is more difficult for them, and that's different from the past. And this is not a normative argument. I'm not going and saying it was better in the past than it is today. I'm just describing the situation, like Mr. Schwenker, who said we are faced with the uncertainties in a different way. It's different today than it was 40 years ago. Mrs. Bauknecht, Mr. Paulus, and the second chance. There are two sides we have to see. On the one hand, we are dealing with legal framework conditions, the private insolvency procedures, which is based on the U.S. model. It was introduced here 20 years ago, too. And then secondly, we have to adjust our culture, so to speak. We have to allow failure, i.e., a second chance. And then people are getting older, too. They might fail, but they are getting older. But in a culture, in a setting where only the young ones are being hired, the older ones, in particular those who have failed, are not employed anymore. They don't get a second chance. They don't get an opportunity to prove themselves. So here we could change things. So it's a mix, I'd say, between legal framework conditions and the general mood, the mentality, or the setting in society in order to change people's ideas about professional careers. I think we are on our way towards a second chance, which is also due to the fact that we are moving towards a new founders culture in Germany, a new period of new companies that are being set up. The question is, how do we speak about it? How do we write about it? The success story is always much more interesting than the story of failure, but we have to learn to write about both. And then, of course, you're right. Big data is an important topic. But then we do have to see the problems, too. We know from the case of credit card companies that these know who will get a divorce in the next 2 years. I mean, that's interesting. They see our transactions and they know who will get a divorce, and they react by, for example, canceling the credit card of the wife or the husband. So they get the data, and they know that something will happen, but they don't know why. So we lack the causes or the causalities. We do see a pattern, but we don't understand how it works. And this is what we need for a strategic analysis. Otherwise, big data don't make much sense for your strategy, because you see something today which is true today, but you don't know whether it will be true in 5 more years because it lacks the causality. Right. Big data, that's certainly true, but we have to ask, first of all, the question, why? And we will have to learn how to deal with things differently. Professor Kirchhoff, please, I'm very happy to see you here. Professor Kirchhoff is also a member of the CONVOCO forum, so he's been closely in touch with the forum and with me for many years. Right. I would like to agree, and I would like to come back to genetic and engineering. And I would like to underline that the insecurity of human beings is the condition for our happiness. I mean, just imagine we capable of anticipating everything, foreseeing everything, knowing that a business will fail or not, a marriage will fail or not, being happy or not. I mean, we all know what the end will be. Prometheus is one of the Greek legends. It's about a person, a group of people who were able to anticipate. They knew what their lives would look like, and they would die and when. So people did not move anymore because they thought, well, we will die anyway. But then when Prometheus saw it, took away their capacity of foreseeing the future, and he gave them hope. And that's the important aspect, which also leads us towards freedom, which will be part of our discussion in the second round. I mean, there is no freedom only because you know what will happen. And in particular, you won't be free once you know. So we need insecurity. We need uncertainty. This is not a deficit. This is not a failure. Only those who are not brave enough to move and try and find a way will fail, I say. And that's what we have to bear in mind. So we may well be relaxed and modest. Further questions?
Professor Terence Keeley from Buckingham University.
Thank you. Could I just address Corinne Flick's point about it seems that we're under greater uncertainty than ever before, and others were disputing that, and why should that be? I think we can objectively say that we're not facing greater uncertainty because the economic historians have told us that since 1830, the lead industrial countries have been growing steadily at 2% a year, which means under creative destruction that every year 2% of people lose their jobs and 2% of people have to retrain for new jobs. And this has been going on for 200 years. And the aeroplane, the car, all these things were just as uncertain as they are now. So the question is, why does it feel more uncertain now than before? And I think the answer is, why do lead countries only grow 2% a year? I think that managers for the last 200 years have not been able to cope with the rate of growth of change of more than 2% a year because it's just beyond human capacity collectively. So I think we've been uncertain for 200 years, but each generation has felt the uncertainty, and the limit is 2% growth because more than that is beyond human capacity. That's my suggestion anyway.
Terence, I think I totally agree with you. That was a misunderstanding. It was just a question to Professor Beckert, if he thinks it has increased. Hier vorne ist eine Frage.
Ja, vielen Dank. Thorsten Luther, mein Name.
Thorsten Luther, my name. I'm a consultant from Munich. Now, you've talked about failing and that we have to bear in mind that we can or will fail. I wonder, are there situations in which we should not take the possibility of failing on board, because this would be a prophecy to come true just because? Now, we've talked about these cases of self-fulfilling prophecies. But we would like to limit the possibility of not taking the possibility of failure on board to extreme cases. So, of course, you establish buffers in order to mitigate your financial risk, for example, or you try to call in as many people as possible if you have to take risks. Now, that's usually the right approach, but then there might be cases in which the situation might become extreme. Like Mr. Draghi of the ECB says, my only chance is unlimited acquisitions of public bonds. And this needs to be announced, because if I don't announce it, it will fail. Now, you will certainly trigger reactions in such a case, but there are also cases in which you try to combine your forces and act together in order to seek alternative options and be successful in the end. Otherwise, I'd be careful when it comes to the lack of alternative options or the impossibility of finding alternative options.
Internationally. I think there are two different levels, if I might say so, with just calculating, oder ich kann auch Deutsch sprechen, wenn man damit rechnet.
If you consider the option of failing, you have to distinguish the particular situation, i.e., you go and start a business. Now, in such a case, you should not take the option of failure on board. People like Steve Jobs or others did certainly not think of failing. But you're talking about a different level. It's the failure of societies. And here we need a different approach, different methodologies. Don't you think so? Right. What you say is true also with respect to the building of societies, but or companies, that is. But you will certainly not establish your life on a single project. Detlef Kruger, I would like to come back to the operative economic practice. We've talked about the tolerance with respect to failures, to mistakes, and of course, I'm working in the food industry, and here we have to be careful. And mercy has also been mentioned, and then we are living in a growth and performance society, and of course, we do have to respect the limits there are. So there cannot be unlimited mercy either. So I like the idea of hope. But what about courage? I mean, what about encouraging people so that they are more courageous within companies, in society? What can be done in addition to tolerance and mercy and maybe hope in times of uncertainty? Now, there are a number of possibilities. The tolerance with respect to mistakes of failure, that's relative. But then you can, of course, encourage people so that they rethink, or encourage them to make alternative proposals, or to make proposals at all, to encourage them to establish options and possibilities so that people can put their ideas in practice also within companies. I mean, of course, you are in the food industry, and there are clear limits. And of course, it is a disaster if the products you sell are bad, the meat or whatever. But this is not about the culture of your respective society, because you are part of a company which could also deal with tolerance and failures in different ways. So it only works there where people are allowed to say what they think, have an opinion, make things differently, and overcome those rigid structures, because otherwise you maybe trigger resistance, but you also provoke mistakes. The more narrow the narrower the process, the higher the chance that people make mistakes. So we have to be open and flexible with respect to the definition of a process. which allows for a tolerance. I would like to come back to the remark concerning the level of uncertainty or insecurity in the last 200 years. I mean, of course, if you look at the last 200 years, you may be right. But then if you look at things from the perspective of a generation, i.e. if you adopt the generational view, you realize that there are different levels of people in different periods of time. My grandfather was born in 1885. He died in 1949. Now, I sometimes think of the life he had when he was a young man and an adult, 2 wars, inflation, industrialization. I was born in 1967, right into prosperous or prospering post-war Germany. This is a huge difference, and the experiences made by different generations are different, and we have to consider this aspect too. We don't have much time left.
Dinner speaker of last night, Martin Koffel from America. I'm very proud that you're here, Martin, and honored. You gave us last night a wonderful speech. Martin Koffel has one of the Fortune 300 enterprises, URS, which specializes in technology. And I think you maybe can comment Detlef Krüger's question out of your experience, if you like. Do you remember his question? I mean, yeah? No, because there was one in between now. Okay, Detlef, can you just repeat your question for 1 second? With the micro, please.
Yeah. It was a question about what could be additionally done to the tolerance question, what we have now intensively discussed. And there's some kind of, there's a certain amount only of tolerance you could give to growth-oriented company. So what else could you integrate in the culture of a company additionally to that kind of, certainly now I see the point, you can divide into the process-oriented stuff and the rest, the tolerance-oriented one, but maybe there are additional answer.
Well, you must understand that I live in California. I have the attitudes of a Californian. And here I am in Northern Europe in a very old culture. And I think my advice to you all would be, relax. I'm never relaxed. I think you're very precise about your reaction to failure. And you talk about being more tolerant and the need to be more tolerant. I think it's culturally difficult for you. You know, I think the society is so bound up with old law and disciplines and past achievements and so forth, and precise forms of government. And I find in dealing with German companies, whom I find to be excellent at execution, in fact. Last night I was talking about the need for execution, and if I were to think of a group of companies that are very strong on execution, which is the best way to eliminate or contain risk, it would be execution, and German companies do very well at that. But I think the leadership has to do more than just say we ought to tolerate mistakes and we ought to tolerate experimentation. I think you genuinely have to do it. And I think there have to be clear public examples inside an organization that you mean it. And that people who, I think you need to take young people who try and don't quite make it and reward them publicly. But I would say, relax.
Okay,
just let it happen.
This is always good. And relax is jetzt auch.
Relax might be an excellent buzzword. Let's have a short break and let's continue afterwards. Thank you.